Hello friends, my name is JJ, and check out these big books of stamps I bought from the post office the other day. You see, in any given year, the Canadian Post Office, or Canada Post as it is known, releases a bunch of new stamps for the people, and at the end of the year, they document them all in books like these. Canada's actually a pretty historically important country when it comes to the cultural evolution of stamps, as it was in this land back in 1851 that the world's first ever stamp depicting something other than a king or politician was released. This one, featuring the humble beaver, Canada's beloved national animal. And ever since 1851, the Canadian Post Office has continued in this way, releasing stamps featuring illustrations of all sorts of charming, random things relevant to Canada's identity and culture. This has included such hits as Birds of Canada, Lakes of Canada, Dogs of Canada, and of course, Roads of Canada. But after 150 years of this, Canada Post has now mostly picked all of the low-hanging fruits of Canadian culture, including low-hanging fruits of Canada. But that is a good thing, because it means that the stamps they put out these days tend to be a lot more obscure and creative, and thus a lot more educational and interesting. And that is why I bought these books. For you see, every year, Canada Post releases a richly illustrated hardcover volume documenting all of the different stamps that they sold in that past year, usually about 20 or so. And so I thought it might be interesting to do a quick flip through and see what the Government of Canada has been selling back to us as symbols of the nation's culture in the cold and cynical 2020s. But first, a quick word from today's video sponsor, Incogni. Oh, hello friends! You just caught me checking in on my latest Incogni report. I like to keep tabs on how well it's working. What is Incogni, you ask? Well, it is a very cool program that auto-files requests for big data brokerage firms to delete whatever information they have on you. You see, through no fault of your own, you are constantly submitting all sorts of personal information online, and that data then often winds up in the hands of companies who buy and sell it for a living. And this is one of the main reasons why you get bombarded with as many spam emails and phone calls as you do. Under the laws of most Western countries, you have a right to request these companies to stop doing this, but that takes a lot of time and effort, so Incogni does it for you. And thus, I can look at my report here and see that they have filed 152 data deletion requests, of which 146 have been successfully completed, thus saving me over 100 hours of precious time. So if saving time and privacy is on your agenda, why not give Incogni a try? If you click on the link in the thing below and use the promo code JJMCC, you can get an amazing 60% off an annual plan. Saving time and saving money. What's not to like? Incogni. It just makes sense. All right, so let us start our little stamp journey by looking at some of Canada Post's most traditional stamps, beginning with this 2023 one of His Majesty King Charles III. Canada, as we were all reminded recently, is still under the British Crown, and as such, it has been tradition since colonial times to always sell stamps with the face of the reigning king or queen on them. This might be an urban legend, but I've even heard it said that all Canada Post offices are required by law to always have stamps of the current monarch on hand. Charles became king in 2022, so this 2023 number is the first stamp that Canada Post has made to commemorate his reign. Depending on how long he lives, in a couple of years they will probably put out another stamp with a different photo of him on it, which is what they always did for his mother. Canada Post's second longest stamp tradition is always putting out a special Christmas stamp every year. Since there's no formal ban on government endorsing religion in Canada, these stamps tend to be pretty explicitly Christian. You can see the 2023 one has Mary and the Christ child, while the 2024 one has the full Holy Family. Now these days we of course recognize that Canada has a large and growing population of people who belong to religions other than Christianity. And as such, in recent years, the Canadian government has started endorsing other religious holidays in various ways, including through the Post Office. In 2017, Canada Post began issuing yearly stamps for what they identified as the three great non-Christian religious celebrations of Canada: Hanukkah, which is celebrated by Jews; Diwali, which is celebrated by Hindus and Sikhs; and Eid el-Fitr and Eid el-Adha, which are celebrated by Muslims. Somebody who knows more about Islam than me can tell me why the Muslim stamp celebrates two holidays, about wildly different things, celebrated in two non-consecutive months. But in any case, over the 8 years that these multicultural religious holiday stamps have been a thing, Canada Post has used the opportunity to highlight the unique traditions of these distinct cultural communities. In the 2 years that we are looking at, you can see the Muslim stamps featured an ancient Persian bowl from the Royal Ontario Museum and traditional Middle Eastern cookies, while the Diwali ones feature the traditional floral symbols of the holiday and the hands of the Hindu goddess Lakshmi. The Hanukkah ones are a bit more predictable and both just have menorahs. But JJ, I hear you cry, what about the millions of Canadians who don't care about religious stuff? Well, don't you worry, because Canada Post also puts out a special secular stamp every year celebrating Canada's inoffensive, non-denominational winter holiday season, which kind of feels like a backdoor way to just put out a second Christmas stamp, but whatever. For 2023, they put out these stamps, which offer what the book describes as a celebration of Canada's snowy wonderlands, while in 2024, they did a salute to gingerbread houses. All right, so Canadian officialdom likes to speak of Canadian culture as being primarily the product of three discrete ethno-cultural groups: the Anglo-Canadians, the French-Canadians, and the Indigenous Canadians.
The wonder of a country built on the bedrock of three peoples: Indigenous, French, and British.
I personally think that this is a pretty reductive and debatable theory of Canadian identity, but it is very much the official story that the government likes to push. So it shouldn't come as any great surprise that it is also a narrative that is heavily promoted through Canadian stamps. Stamps honoring the royal family would be the main nod to Canada's Anglo heritage, but what about the rest of the big three? Well, on the French-Canadian side, in 2023, they put out stamps honoring three 20th century French-Canadian feminists who fought for women's rights in various ways. I don't think any of these women are exactly household names, but in recent years, Canada Post has been putting a greater emphasis on elevating some of the lesser-known heroes of Canadian history, as opposed to just the usual lineup of prime ministers, explorers, and generals. In 2024, meanwhile, they honored celebrated French-Canadian authors. I find it pretty interesting who they selected for this particular cultural canon, just because it highlights some of the complex political calculations that the Canadian government has to do whenever it comes time to officially celebrate the contributions of the big three. The vast majority of French Canadians live in the province of Quebec, which very much frames itself as the French-Canadian homeland, if not the French-Canadian nation. The government of Canada, meanwhile, likes to push a competing narrative that French Canadians actually have sizable communities all across Canada, in part because this is seen as helping weaken the Quebec separatist movement. As a result of the 5 canonically great French-Canadian authors, only 2 are from Quebec. 1 is from New Brunswick, and 1 is from Ottawa, which are both fairly well known for having large French-Canadian populations. But then the 4th author is from Alberta, which is not. And then this guy, Danny Laferrari, is a black immigrant from Haiti. So you get a sense of the degree that this list was carefully curated to promote a more diverse understanding of the French-Canadian identity than most Canadians might carry around in their heads. Over on the Indigenous Canadian side, meanwhile, we have a 2023 set of 3 stamps honoring champions of Indigenous rights, celebrating 3 Native Canadians from the 20th century who made political history in various ways. Here is George Manuel, who was a prominent chief from British Columbia, associated with the successful movement to get an explicit recognition of Indigenous rights into the Canadian Constitution. Then there's Nellie Cornway, who was an Indigenous Canadian woman who got elected Premier of the Northwest Territories in 1991, and thus became the first non-white woman to lead a government in Canadian history, and then Thelma Chalifoux, who was Canada's first Native Canadian female senator. Now, once again, in picking these three specific people, there is sort of a complicated political balancing act going on. The Canadian Constitution defines Aboriginal people as including the Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. And as a result, whenever the government celebrates the cultural contributions of Indigenous Canadians, they are always careful to acknowledge the contributions of all three groups in equal proportion. So Manuel was the head of the British Columbia Union of Indian Chiefs, Cornway was of Inuit heritage, and Senator Chalifoux was Métis, which is a distinct community of mixed-race people who identify as Indigenous. We can see the same thing when we look at these 2024 stamps, which honor three Indigenous Canadian women of vision who were involved in various sorts of cultural advocacy. So we have Josephine Mandamin, an Anishinaabe elder, Eliza P. Isaac, an Inuit singer, and Christy Belcourt, a Métis artist. Always have to have the big three represented within the context of the larger big three. Since 2022, the government has also chosen to honor Indigenous Canadian history in a fairly dark way by releasing an annual set of stamps commemorating Canada's notorious Indian residential schools. These are, of course, the ultra-assimilationist boarding schools that Native children were put into during the 19th and 20th centuries and are now increasingly recognized as the single greatest human rights abuse in Canadian history. Even though it might seem a little ghoulish to release stamps commemorating such a grim chapter of Canada's past, the thinking is that continuing to prominently acknowledge these schools is an important part of the reconciliation process that now forms a large part of the Canadian government's Native policy. All right, moving on. Another force that has been gaining influence in recent years and shaping a sort of elite conception of Canadian culture is the movement to acknowledge the contributions of the Black Canadians. African Canadians are sometimes considered the forgotten minority of Canadian history, overshadowed by groups that have been more officially celebrated and politically protected, despite the fact that it's easy to argue that Black Canadians hold a comparable historic relevance as a uniquely North American cultural community. Conceding this, in 2011, Canada Post started a tradition of releasing at least one stamp a year honoring the contributions of Black Canadians. In 2023, the honor went to Chloe Cooley. She was an enslaved woman in late 18th century Canada who famously caused a scene during an attempt to sell her, which became a popular anecdote among Canadian abolitionists about the inhumanity of slavery. In 2024, the honor went to Mary Ann Shadd. She was a free Black woman from the US who had moved to Canada with her family during the antebellum years and edited an influential anti-slavery American newspaper. She's a woman that I've always found to be very interesting just in how her story and writings reveal a lot of nuances in how Black people in those days conceptualized the differences between Canada and the US. All right, now perhaps less politically heavy is Canada Post's proud tradition of putting out stamps featuring Canadian celebrities. At one time, the post office wouldn't even make stamps of famous people unless they were dead, but they got rid of that policy a while ago and now routinely put out stamps featuring Canadian superstars of stage and screen who are still very much alive. Canada Post might view itself as the official canonizer of Canadian culture, but they're also in the business of making stamps that people actually want to buy, and Canadian celebrity stamps tend to be reliable crowd pleasers. In 2023 and 2024, they accordingly put out stamps featuring famed Canadian directors Norman Jewison and Denis Arcand, Oscar-winning Canadian actor Donald Sutherland, the trailblazing NHL player William O'Ree, and beloved Canadian songstress Sarah McLachlan. 2024 also featured a pretty interesting set of stamps saluting 5 Canadian graphic novelists: Chester Brown, Gregory Gallant, Michael Rabaglati, and Gillian and Mariko Tamaki. I don't know how famous these people are outside of Canada, but I feel like anybody who is into comics in this country will probably recognize their work. Independent of the stamps designed to commemorate the history of certain Canadian ethno-cultural groups, Canada Post will also reliably put out a couple of stamps every year commemorating the various other events of Canada's past. 2023 marked the 150th anniversary of the iconic Royal Canadian Mounted Police, so of course they got a commemorative stamp. In 2024, meanwhile, they released a stamp honoring the contributions of Canadian women who tended to the nation's farms during the Second World War when the men were away fighting. The soldiers of the soil, as they were evidently known. I feel like city slickers like me tend to think of wartime women as working in munitions factories, which is what my own grandmother did. But for Canadians from more rural communities, the period where grandma ran the farm is an equally iconic symbol of the female contribution to the war effort. And here is another war-themed one. It honors a woman named Mona Parsons, who I had never heard of, and even the Canadian Encyclopedia calls unfamiliar. And she was apparently the only Canadian woman held as a POW during World War II. Mona was an upper-class woman who had married a Dutch man and moved to Holland before the war, and then, after the Nazi conquest of that country, was briefly involved in the Dutch resistance. For this, she was then caught and imprisoned in Germany for 4 years, only to make a brave escape near the end of the war.
I will escape.
And she did escape.
So it's a pretty compelling story, and I guess another example of the sort of lesser-known episodes of Canadian history that Canada Post likes to take it upon itself to celebrate. All right, and then lastly, we have my favorite kind of Canadian stamps, which are just the light and breezy tributes to the various innocuous aspects of Canadian life. So we have a salute to Canadian fairies, a salute to Canadian frogs, a salute to Canadian animals who have particularly adorable babies, a salute to 2 different Canadian wildflowers, a salute to the beauty of watching an eclipse in Canada, and a salute to the Great Canadian Road Trip, where you get to witness the loveliness of the cross-country Canadian landscape. Canada Post always seems to be able to come up with some fresh pretext to issue a new set of stamps that just show scenes of Canadian nature, which makes me think that these are probably the sort of stamps that sell best. Growing up, I certainly remember Canadian nature stamps were the ones that my parents would always buy. This one is quite fun as well. It's a salute to Much Music, or as it was known in Quebec, Musique Plus. Much Music was basically Canada's answer to MTV, a TV station founded in the 1980s to air music videos all day. It became a very beloved part of Gen X and millennial culture in Canada, and played a huge role in shaping the tastes of young Canadians in the pre-internet age, where knowledge of anything hip and cool had to come primarily from television.
Hi, I'm Dave from Foo Fighters, and you're watching Much Music. Tonight!
So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little tour of Canadian stamps. I don't know why I've never really done much stamp analysis on this channel before, given they represent conscious efforts to canonize specific sets of culturally important things, and that's the sort of stuff I'm really into. But on the other hand, since stamps are issued by the government, they can also be fairly culturally prescriptivist, in the sense of elites telling the public what they're supposed to care about. I, meanwhile, am much more of a cultural descriptivist, in the sense that I'm more interested in what the public seems to care about when left to their own devices, independent of top-down narratives. But I suppose, at best, stamps can be both. And I have to say, I do honestly think that overall, Canada Post does a pretty good job straddling that line. But anyway, I am curious to hear your thoughts on stamps, if you've ever seen any particularly interesting ones from Canada or the US or some other place. A few years ago, I made a video all about the various sports balls that the US Post Office considered to be particularly relevant to American culture, and it would be fun to do another video like that again someday. So let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week.